20th, 2006. My name is David Lawrence. We're at the Atlanta History Center as part of the World War II Veterans History Project. We're honored today to have Mr. Herman Bodenheimer from High Point, North Carolina, whose daughter and granddaughter live in the Atlanta area, and we're delighted to have him here to talk about what it was like growing up during the Depression, initially in Indiana, then in North Carolina, what his feelings were during the 1930s, getting married before the war, and where he was on Pearl Harbor Day, and what happened to him afterwards. And we're delighted to have you with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you and let you just free associate. So we're ready for you to talk.
Well, thank you. I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana in 1913, and my father was Charles Bodenheimer, and my mother's name was Maria Wilhelmina Sophia Schmidt. My mother was born in this country. My father's family and my mother's family came over from Germany after the Franco-Prussian War, and my German grandfather was a veteran of the German army that helped liberate Paris from the French people during the Franco-Prussian War. Where was I? I went to a Lutheran parochial school in Indianapolis, Indiana, and when I was about 14 years old, my father had inherited some land in North Carolina, and we moved to North Carolina, and I finished high school in High Point, North Carolina. After high school, I got a job at a furniture plant as a clerk, writing out production tickets and calculating the rates to pay people at, and so forth and so on. In the meantime, I went to several night schools and eventually acquired a degree from State College in industrial engineering. My wife was a registered nurse who was born in Durham, North Carolina, and we were married on July the 3rd, 1941. Her folks lived near Durham, North Carolina, and on I think it's December the 11th, Pearl Harbor Day, December the 11th, is that correct?
December the
7th? Well, the 7th. Okay, on December the 7th, we were traveling back from Durham, North Carolina to High Point, where we lived, and we heard over the car radio about Pearl Harbor. And of course, that was all you could hear from then on about Pearl Harbor the rest of the time. And the next day was Monday, I believe, and I went back to work on Monday. But I did not get drafted until 1942, in December of 1942. I was 29 years old when I was drafted. When I was drafted at Camp Croft, South Carolina, I was in Camp Croft for about 6 or 7 days, and I was put on a troop train and sent to Fresno, California for Army Air Force's basic training. And my basic training lasted 6 days. And from there I went to Wilburton, Oklahoma, to a college that the Army had confiscated. And they tried to teach me the Army regulations and a lot of the paperwork connected with the supply function of the Air Corps. After that, I went to Salt Lake City, and then from Salt Lake back to Blythe, California, and I went with the 34th Bomb Group out of Blythe, California, and stayed there several months, learning the supply area of the Air Corps, and took a trip to LA with a bunch of people. Here's the photographs of that. And shall I tell about the time when we were driving in a staff car and the sergeant there, we became good friends. He was an Italian. His name was D apostrophe Arc, A, capital A, R, C, Arc, capital Angelo. D. Arcangelo. Of course, we called him Doc. Anyway, I went with him and 3 more folks. Doc was very, very wise in all the affairs of the Army. So we took a staff car and went to Los Angeles from the desert. When we were in California, we, like a lot of GIs, were drinking a little. Not much, but a little. Anyway, we were passing up, and we had a staff car, and he had made out all the tickets for the staff car, and the reason we had a staff car was, ostensibly, we had to take it to March Field for 3rd echelon maintenance. Anyway, when we ran out of gas, apparently we would go out in the desert and find a bunch of troop armored divisions were maneuvering out in the deserts. We would drive up to the gas tanks and have them fill a staff car with gasoline. Doc was very, very knowledgeable in how to fill out all the forms and things of that sort. Anyway, in Los Angeles, the one thing I'll always remember was we were passing around the bottle, and there were 3 of us sitting in the back seat, and I was sitting in the middle. And we had killed a 5th of liquor, and I had finished the very last of it, and I had the empty bottle, and I said, "What shall I do with the bottle?" And the fellow on my right side said, "Well, just toss it out of the window." And he rolled down the window, and I tossed it out and passed a street sign, and it said Hollywood and Vine. It's a wonder we weren't arrested and put in jail. Anyway, that was a fine excursion. When the 398th Bomb Group was activated, they picked the people from the 34th Bomb Group to be the, what we call the initial Kadri. And in my squadron, the 601st Squadron, there were 4 squadrons in the 398th Bomb Group, 600, 601, 602, and 603. In the 603rd, there were 4 officers and 3 enlisted men in the initial Kadri, and we were all to be the department heads. I was a supply sergeant for the bomb squadron. We had a first sergeant, and we had a line chief who took care of the planes on the line. Each one of the squadrons had these initial Kadri, and we were put on a Pullman and sent to Orlando, Florida, to Army Air Force's School of Applied Tactics. And among other things I learned at the School of Applied Tactics was how to fire a bazooka. People today may not know what a bazooka was, but there was a comedian on radio that had a bazooka that he played. It was simply a huge mouth organ of some kind. Anyway, but what the bazooka was that I learned to fire was a shoulder-held rocket launcher. And I learned to fire the bazooka. And after we left initial training, I never saw a bazooka again. So that training it was a fine experience, but it was of no practical use. From Geiger Field, we went to, from Orlando, Florida, went to Geiger Field in Spokane, Washington. And at Geiger Field, we started to get some airplanes and started to get some people from the various schools. They were training mechanics, you know, and as they trained a mechanic, they would send them to us, and we would put them to work and flesh out all our departments. We stayed there a couple of months, and then we went to Rapid City, South Dakota. And then from Rapid City, we started getting all of our people. I would get the rest of the people in the supply room, the people on the line, the crew chiefs would get their mechanics, the orderly room would get their clerks, the cooks, the master cook would get his cooks, the ordnance people would get the people in the bomb dump to learn how to load the planes with bombs. The armament people would know how to take care of the machine guns and so forth and so on. It took our motto in those days was keep them flying. And we had 18 B-17 bombers. A B-17 bomber had 4 engines and a crew of 10 people for a B-17 bomber. We stayed there, and Mr. Hitler was shooting down more of our planes over Europe. So instead of us being on combat status, we were changed to training status, and for about a year all we did was train crews and train them how to fly the bombers. Then we must have gained on Mr. Hitler, and then we were put back on combat status, and we went to England. We went to England not in a convoy, but in a rather small, fast cruiser, brand new. It was so fast, it could outrun the submarines. So we went to England. I don't remember how many days it took. We ran into a heavy storm one time, I know that, and it broke all of the scaffolding they had with the stacks of plates in the ship, and we ate 2 times a day on the ship. And I remember the day after the storm, we had to wade through cutlery that was on the floor. They hadn't had time yet to clean it up where it broke loose during the storm. We got almost to Ireland, and then the sailors on the ship were Coast Guard people, and by rumor and hearsay they said the reason why we turned around, we were almost to Ireland, we turned around and headed back up into the North Atlantic, and the rumor was that they had rumors of a wolf pack laying in wait for us out in near Ireland. So we went up there till the wolf pack got gone, and we went to cruise past Ireland, and eventually wound up in a place called Nuthamstead in England, about 35 miles from London. It was equidistant between London, 35 miles one way, and Cambridge was about 20 miles on the other way. And we were up toward a neck of the North Sea. And at our base, we were 20 minutes flying time away from German-occupied Europe. When the Germans would come over and try to get into London, or to get it somewhere where they wanted to bomb, they would come in over that neck of the North Sea to avoid the British radar. And they would pass over our base trying to head into London. When the night fighters, the British Army had night fighters, and when the night fighters would drive off the Germans at night, they come over our base, and on a moonlit night, see our airplane sitting down there, they run over and strafe us, just to get rid of their ammunition, you know. And we had 2 very, very small hangars, and everything else was out in the open. They did their best, but I don't think they ever damaged the plane very much at all. But we had a lot of holes in those 2 small hangars. I say that we had 18 airplanes in the 601st, and the 4 squadrons had 18 apiece. That'd be a total of 72 bombers. The normal way they flew they would probably try to fly half of each squadron on one mission, and then when these 9 would come back, they would spend all their time trying to repair the battle damage of these planes, and then for the next mission they would have these 9 that had already been repaired. They send them out on the next mission, so it was just kind of an alternate. They would never fly all 18 planes on the same mission. Then when they would lose an airplane over Germany, one of my jobs was to write up the lost in action. And I had to write up the number of the airplane, and then write up the serial number of all the engines and any equipment on the airplane. I would write up lost in action so I could drop it from accountability, because you had to account for everything you had, every piece of equipment you had, it had to be accounted for. So that was one of the things I had to do. And I remember that we lost the first few planes we lost. I had no trouble in getting a serial number of all the engines. That had to be one part of it. And then it got to a point where I would call the engineering officer and tell him that I needed the serial number of the engines on plane number so-and-so that we lost today over in Germany somewhere. And I can always remember what he said one time. He said, "Herman," he said, "how in the hell can I keep up with the serial number of these engines? Because we're taking engines from damaged planes and putting them in this plane, and we're taking engines and we're swapping engines all the way around, and I have no idea what the serial numbers are on these engines anymore." And I said, "Well, give me the prefix, the first 3 numbers of the series of them." And he gave me the prefix of them, and from then on the rest of the war, I manufactured numbers for the engines. And I never had a feedback. Anyway, the clerks didn't know any better in London.
Did you know any of the crews very well that you lost?
Yes? No. I knew all of the crews, because everyone passed through supply, all the officers and all of the enlisted men. 6 enlisted men on every crew, and I never knew them intimately. I never went on leave with them and went to the pub with them for the nearest town, so forth and so on. But I was an old man in the outfit. I was 30 years old. And these youngsters, the crewmen, the 6 enlisted crewmen particularly, they would be from 17 to 18 and 19 years old, just out of high school, where they took their flight training and came in. And I'll tell you a story about one of them. One fellow came in, and he would tell me about his father and mother. His father was a druggist, and he was from a small town in Arkansas. His father owned a drugstore, and after the war was over, he pulled a picture out and showed me a picture of his girlfriend. He said, "When I finish my 25 missions, I'm going back to the States and get married, and then I'm going to college and learn to be a pharmacist like my father, who owns a drugstore. And then we have it all planned. We are going to open up another drugstore in a small adjacent town in Arkansas." And I said, "Well, that sounds like you have your line all planned out." And he said, "Yes, sir." And I believe he had finished about 17 or 18 missions. And one day he came in the supply room with the rest of his buddies on the crew, because these crews, these six enlisted men on the crew, they were all just like brothers after a while. He had bought a dog from a farmer, and he showed me the dog, and I opened a box of K rations and gave him a cracker or two, and the dog liked K rations. So every time he would come and supply, he would bring the little dog with him. And I made a pet out of him by feeding him crackers out of K ration. One afternoon, he came into the supply room and said, I'm not coming back tomorrow. And I said, sure you are. It'll be a pit. You don't even know what the target is. You won't even know what the target is till tomorrow morning when you get briefed. And I said, it'll probably be a piece of cake. No flak, no fighters, and we'll laugh about this when you come back. And he very quietly said, no, Sergeant. He said, I'm not coming back tomorrow. But I just want to let you know that I've told the other crew, other 6 men in the barracks, the other crew, 2 crews slept in the barracks. I've told them that you are to have my dog. The next afternoon, the other crew in the barracks, all 6 enlisted men, came in and had the dog. And they said, James told us last night that when, not if he didn't come back, but when he did not come back today, that you were to have his dog. So they gave me the dog, and I petted it and thought for a while. And finally I said, appreciate it, appreciate what you've done, appreciate you bringing me a dog, but I said, I have a little problem, and maybe you folks can help me with it, but I sleep here. I have my own quarters built out of bomb boxes in the supply room, and when I'm absent, I don't have anyone to look after the dog. And I wish I had someone to help me take care of the dog, but I just don't have anybody that I know of could help me take care of the dog. But I said, I just wonder, would you folks like to take the dog back to your barracks, and could you all take care of him? And would you believe it? Their faces lit up, and they said, oh, Sergeant, we'd love to. We'd love to take care of the dog. And they took the dog back. That was the end of that story. He knew. Now, how did he know, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was not coming back tomorrow? I asked him, I said, what happened? And he said, well, we got near the target, and the flak guns got him and took a wing off, and the plane, when they take a wing off, the plane just falls like a rock, and the centrifugal force, you know, they can't jump out. They can't jump out because they're pinned inside the plane. And all 10 of them were killed. Anyway, that was one story about the crew people. They would come in, and another time they'd like to talk to me because I was an old man. To them, one of the officers came in one day, and he sat down and he said, man, and I said, how did it go today? Came in from they would come back from a mission 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They'd like to go out in the morning, and come back in the afternoon from the mission. And he said, man, it was something. He said, I never saw so much flak in all my life today. And he said, we went over the target, and the flak was so heavy out there, you could almost walk on it. You know what flak is. You could almost walk on the flak. And he said, after the war is over, he said, I'm going to go find out who that gun crew was, who one of those gun crews was down there. Because he said, we were flying about 29,000 feet, and they were sending that flak up there right underneath us. He said, they were good. Imagine that. He wasn't a pilot, he was a navigator, I think. He said, those folks were good down there. He said, man, it was just incredible how they could calculate our speed, the wind direction, which direction we were going, how fast the wind was blowing, and yet they were putting that flak up right underneath us. He said, we lost 3 planes today, but those guys down there were good. Now, can you imagine the fellow flying an airplane and seeing that flak all around you and seeing 3 planes go down and he admiring the accuracy of and the skill of those gunners down there. And he was sincere about that. He was smiling. He said, those fellows down there were good. I told that story to some people, and they were horrified that here that man could admire the skill of those gunners down there on the ground.
I think there was a lot of mutual admiration for skill in the war.
Well, there was an instance, and it was not in our squadron, and this was told to me by a P-51. We had a P-51 base near us, and the P-51s, after they put the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines in the P-51, they gained about 200 miles range, and they were able to engage the German fighters in combat. This one pilot was with his group, and they engaged the German pilot, and there was a lot of attrition on both sides, and he got 2 German fighters himself, and eventually they damaged his plane, so he had to bail out. And by that time, you knew what your limit was on your gasoline, and you knew exactly when you had to turn around and head back to England. So everyone else had to go back. What was left of them had to go back to England, and he was left. And they finally damaged his plane, and he parachuted out. And as he was floating down, 4 German fighters cruised alongside of him, and every one of them gave him a salute. Incredible. Incredible. That was mutual admiration.
Yeah.
Mutual admiration. I don't even remember where I was. Where was I?
Well, you were. We were.
Tell them about the man who faced death 3 times when they
well,
went by.
Another pilot came in, and he was, you know what an operations officer is in the Air Corps. He was the boss man of the flight echelon. He's the boss man of the crews, the operations officer. His rank would be a major. He's on. Anyway, this fellow came in as a replacement crew, and I don't know why. He wasn't older. He was about, maybe might have been 21 years old. But he was a gentleman, and smart, intelligent, and through attrition, he got to be assistant operations officer. And that particular day, the commanding officer and the operations officer, they didn't allow them to fly every mission or every other mission because they were too valuable to lose. Anyway, he was flying the outfit that day and flying the lead plane on a mission. And he said they had been briefed that morning that the Germans had a few operational jet airplanes, but he had never seen one before. But on that particular day, he said they were near the target, and he saw 3 planes boring in on him, and they were the German jets, the Messerschmitt 102s, I believe. Anyway, he saw they were boring right in at him, and he said they were incredibly fast. Incredibly fast. He said they were so fast it was impossible to bear a machine gun on them. It's just that fast they were. And he knew they were coming right at him, and he knew he had it. But they veered off and took off a wingman, and the 3 jets concentrated their firepower on a wingman and shot him down, and swooped around, came back the second time, and bored right into him again, and at the last minute veered off and took off a wingman again. Took off another wing, shot it down. He said they came back around the 3rd time and did the same thing, and he knew the 3rd time that this time they're going to get me. But instead of that, they concentrated their fire on another ship and shot it down, and he lived. He came back in, and he was a little, what's the word today we use? He was a little wired. You know what I mean by wired?
I think I would have been wired too.
He was a little wired, and he sat down, and he was an officer, and I was an enlisted man, but still I was a supply sergeant, and I had my finger on everything. And a supply sergeant is a little powerhouse. You know, I had a little, I don't know what you call it, but anyway, everybody always caters to the supply sergeant. He didn't, because he would talk to me occasionally. He talked to me. He wanted to tell me this again. And I know that he had told it several times in operations. I know he had made his reports out and told it to them, but he wanted to tell it again in his own words and give me a little, and he did not know it, but he gave me a little indication rather, of his feelings and how he felt. And he was a little bit wired. You could tell that from his gestures, and he spoke a little faster when he was telling me this tale. And at the end of it, all I could do was nod my head and say, "Man, you had it today, didn't you? You had Lady Luck riding on your shoulders today." And he got up and walked out and left. But he'd like to tell it to me one more time,
Sure.
just to get rid of it.
Yeah.
You know, you tell a story often enough, you get rid of it.
I suspect you listen to a lot of stories like that.
Yes, yes, quite a few.
Some people know how to listen and some people don't. You appear to have the ability to listen.
It was fascinating. Well, I can tell you something that I thought was hilarious that happened. When we would get a replacement crew in from the States, the last thing they would do in the States, they would give them all sorts of equipment, you know, so they could fly their bomber. See, the crew always had their own bomber, and they would keep it. They keep it through training, keep the same ship through training, and at the last minute before they left the States, you know, they had to make 4 hops to get to England. I don't remember the exact sequence, but it took about 8 hours to fly from mid-America, mid-United States to a place in New Hampshire, I think. From New Hampshire, it took 6 hours, I believe, to get to New Hampshire, because B-17 is slow.
Sure.
Then from them they went to, in Labrador, Newfoundland, another hop. That only took about 4 hours. Then from there they would go to, I forget the name, I don't remember the name of the field, Meeks Field, I believe it is, in Iceland. They go to Iceland, another hop, and that took 6 hours. And then from there they would fly to England, from Meeks Field, Iceland, which is a short way to England from there. Anyway, that's how the replacement crews came in. Whenever we lost a bomber, we'd get a replacement crew. These replacement crews would fly to what we call a sub-depot in England, and when we lost a bomber, why, somebody somewhere would pick up a telephone and say, "We need another airplane." So another crew would fly in, a replacement crew from sub-depot, and usually they would be just 2 or 3 days from the States. In the States, they were issued all sorts of equipment, and every one of them was issued a .45 caliber automatic, complete with holster and ammunition. Why they wanted to issue a flight crew .45 caliber pistol, I don't know. But as soon as they landed at our base, came to our base in England, the 8th Air Force rules and regulations said you had to turn your .45 in, because if you were shot down and if you managed to parachute out over Germany and were captured by some of the populace down there who had been bombed, and if you had the weapon and if you showed it and tried to brandish it and be a hero to kill some of the Germans, they would kill you. So the 8th Air Force said, turn them in, and if you parachute out, you're unarmed, and hopefully you'll be captured by some of the policemen or some of the Army or the Air Force, whatnot, and they'll take you and put you in the the prisoners' camp. But if you're captured in by civilians in some town that has bitter feelings toward the bombers. Some of the more radical of the population could kill you, and it did happen. They killed a lot of, not a lot, but there's been several instances where the population have killed people who parachuted out. Anyway, the rule said that you had to turn your 45 in. Well, a lot of these people had a 45 and they never had a 45 before, and these were nice new toys they had. These young boys loved these 45s, the officers as well as the men. They were reluctant to turn them in, so the commanding officer, usually they got ration cards in England, and the ration cards were issued from the orderly room, but the commanding officer asked me, he didn't ask me, he told me, to take these ration cards and don't give them to these new replacement crews until they've turned in their 45, because they won't turn them any other way. And he was a nice, very nice commanding officer. He didn't want to make a big issue of it, so he thought, well, if they have to turn their 45 in to get a ration card, they'll turn them in and we won't have any problem. So they did that, and most everyone turned in their 45 to me. And when they turned the 45 into me, I would make out a ration card for them. Now they could buy cigarettes, a limited supply every week. Now they could buy a little candy every week with a ration card. Now they could buy toothpaste. Now they could buy little tiny odds and ends that you couldn't buy anywhere else. Because you couldn't buy them in England. No one had them for sale in England anywhere, because they were strictly rationed. They were more rationed than we were. We lived a life of luxury compared to British civilians. Anyway, they turned in their 45. And one crew came in, and they were laughing and talking. And one by one, they turned their 45 in, and they held off to this last man, turned his 45, last man. He was about 19 years old. He turned in his 45. When he turned his 45 in, they were all standing around watching, because they had this planned, I think. He said, they were standing around laughing, looking at him and grinning, and he said, Sergeant, he said, I didn't mind turning in my 45. Look what my daddy gave me before we left the States. And he reached in his uniform and pulled out a .38, looked like a Smith & Wesson revolver. That was hilarious. We every one of us just busted out laughing, and that was the most hilarious thing I think that happened. Pulled that out and said, look what my daddy gave me before we left the States, had a Smith & Wesson. By that one act, he had defeated every rule and regulation of the United States Army. That was hilarious.
Tell him about the story about the man who withheld his 45.
Oh, well,
I love that story.
that was one instance. And, I had no authority to do anything. I wouldn't have taken that 45 away from him if I had the authority. I would not have taken that I'm sorry, I would not have taken that .38 revolver away from him. If someone had almost given me an order to do it, I probably would have refused to do it. That's how I felt about that boy. Another crew came in, and one by one, they turned in their 45s, and I gave them a ration card. And the pilot, the pilot of the airplane is the boss man of all 10 people of his whole crew. And he came over to me, and he was grinning. He said, Sergeant, he said, I'm not going to give you my 45. And I grinned back, and I said, okay, you don't get a ration card, He said, I don't care. He said, we've all made up, and all my crew made up, and they're going to keep me supplied with cigarettes, and they're going to keep me supplied with all the candy I want. They're going to keep me supplied with everything that I need a ration card for. So I don't have to turn in, and we've all made up. I can keep my 45, and they're going to keep me supplied with all these things, but since I don't have a ration card. I said, all right. So it wasn't more than about 3 or 4 weeks later, the whole crew came back in, and they were grinning, you know, like they had something. And the pilot came over to me, and they asked for me, and I came over, talked to him, and he said, let me tell you a story of what happened today. And he said, we were over on the outskirts of Berlin today, and he said, we were over near the target area, and when they make their bomb run, the pilot holds the plane real steady, and the bombardier takes over with his Norden bomb sight, and the bombardier takes over then, and he holds the plane right on course, and he looks in his bomb sight to know when to drop, to press the trigger or pull the lever, whatever they did, to start the bomb train running to drop the bombs. You know what a bomb train is? Well, there's cradles. Every bomb fits in a little cradle, and they have a huge bunch of bombs on this cradle. And this cradle revolves, and when the bombardier pushes the button, the cradle starts revolving and drops those bombs out through the bomb bay doors, one at a time, bomb, bomb, bomb. As the cradle falls over, it releases the bomb. Anyway, the bombardier was over the target, and he tried to release the bomb tray, and it wouldn't work. And he couldn't figure out, and he called over to the pilot and told the pilot, and the pilot turned the controls over to the co-pilot, and he came over to see what the trouble was. And they looked down the bomb bay doors, you know, and they thought they could see some obstruction down there that was holding the train, I call it a train, a bunch of things on chains, and there was an obstruction down there that would prevent the train from rolling. He told the story now. He said, 2 people got a hold of me. One got a hold of one leg, and one fellow got a hold of the other leg, and they held me upside down over Berlin, and poked me way down in there to where that obstruction was, and I managed to get it loose. It must have been a tool of some kind. I managed to get the tool loose, and when I got the tool loose, and he said, I had my 45 in my shoulder holster, and my 45 fell out, and it fell down on Berlin. I went over and got a ration card and filled it out and just gave it to him. I thought this was I said, that was a fine story. That was a fine story. I knew they made it up. It wasn't about, less than 2 weeks later, I found out it was an exact true story. That he got a commendation because, by the way, he got controls back. He turned around, came back, and made a second bomb run over the target, which was very unusual. Yeah. A second bomb run over the target and dropped his bombs. And he got a commendation for that. It was a true story.
They're all true stories.
It was a true story. And
Can you fit Yihui ton in here somehow? Can you talk about Yihui ton in here somehow?
well,
You might have to digress a little bit, but
I wish I had found out a little bit more about Yihui Tun. His name was Y-E-E, W-E-E, Tun, T-U-N. This was his name. Yihui Tun came into the outfit in England as a basic. Basics were people that weren't clerks, they weren't mechanics, they weren't radio operators, they weren't weather people, they weren't medics, and they weren't cooks. They did not have a specialized skill. But the basics, in my opinion, were very important people. They kept the latrines clean, they kept the fires burning in the latrines and in the orderly room whenever we had cold. Sometimes we run out of coal. But they did the dirty work. They kept the whole area of the 601st Squadron clean. And there was usually about 12 to 16 basics. They did all of the, what we would say now, the janitorial work. No skills. You didn't need skill to sweep up and things like that. You didn't need skills to clean latrines. And he was one of them. He spoke broken English. And I have never, I wish I had researched this, not researched this, but I wish I had delved into it and found out exactly. The story was he came from China, and as he landed in San Francisco, they pulled him off the boat and drafted him, which probably was an exaggeration. But he spoke broken English. He spoke, his English was fluent enough, but it was still a foreign language as far as he was concerned. He had a brother, believe it or not, who was a P-51 pilot, first lieutenant, a brother. His brother and the P-51 base was not too far from us. How they got reunited, I don't know. But his brother would come over to visit his brother, Yihui, and he would come to the mess hall with him, ate with him. He'd go back to the Yihui's quarters in the barracks, and they provided a bunk for him, and he stayed with him. These two brothers were close. You'd see them walking down the area, and they would be, sometimes they would be arm in arm. That was true brotherly love. They were just, it was incredible to see them. Anyway, Yihui was, they said he was a gambler, and I can understand that probably he would. But Yihui was always losing part of his equipment. And whenever he would go on a pass, you had to dress up in Class A uniform, and you had to have every button and your tie was just right, and you know what a Class A uniform is. You never went in town in fatigues. You had to go into town with Class A uniform. Anyway, but Yihui would never have a whole Class A uniform. He's always would come into the supply room, and he would always see me and get me because I would give him whatever he needed. And but the other people would try to give him a hard time, you know, laughing at him and so forth and so on. But I would just give him whatever he needed. He came in one time and he couldn't find a necktie, so I gave him a necktie. I said, "Yihui, where are you going?" And he said, and he said, "Me going to London." And I said, "Yo, what you going to do in London?" And he pulled out his sleeves like that, pulled down both sleeves of his arm, and on each forearm, he had 4 or 5 wristwatches. I said, "Yihui, where in the world did you get those wristwatches?" He said, "Well, people come to me before payday, and they don't have any money, and I would buy their wristwatch." In England, you could not buy a wristwatch. You couldn't buy anything in England, a civilian like that. He said, all they have to do is write home to their mom and papa, and they'll send them another one. But they give me their wristwatches, and I'd pay them for their wristwatch. He said, me going into London, and I go into a pub. He said, I'll go up to the bar in a pub, and I order a brew, and I put my elbows on there, and I pull down my sleeves, on both sleeves, and he said, sooner or later, people come up to me and say, "Yank, you want to sell one of those watches?" And he'd say, "Yeah, I'll sell them." And he said he would come back and he would sell all watches he would have. Sometimes he would have 6, sometimes he would have about 8 watches on his arm. He would come back loaded with money because in England, in spite of the rations, there would always be some civilians that had money from black market or however. You could always find in London money from some people. And Yihui knew how to attract money to his arms. That was hilarious. That was hilarious. I've often wondered whatever happened to Yihui. I can visualize Yihui as being a banker controlling millions of dollars in some bank somewhere,
Probably is.
or a merchant. But Yihui was always smiling, and no matter how dirty the job was that he was doing, he was smiling about it. He was always cheerful. Yihui was a good soldier. He was a good man, a boy. I think he must have been, I don't know whether he's 20 years old or not. But that was interesting, and I've often tried to figure out how he was the last one of the family to come from China. And the rest of the family had been here quite a long time, because his older brother was a naturalized, he had papers, he was a citizen. His brother, they probably sent him to school. The first of the family somewhere had sent him to school, and he acquired an education. He was a P-51 fighter pilot. He had odd.
Did you stay in at your initial base throughout the entire rest of the war? Did you get transferred at any time, or did you remain at the same base?
After the war was over, they said, we're going to take your outfit. We were one of the last bomb groups to go to England during the war. We were one of the last bomb groups to go over. Since we were the last arrival, they said, we're going to put some benches in the planes, and you will ferry troops from England to Casablanca in Africa, and from Casablanca you'll ferry them over to a place, what's the name of the town in Brazil, and Brazil you'll ferry them to the States. So our first sergeant was an alcoholic, a real nice guy, but an alcoholic. And everyone knew it, and everyone covered up for Kerry. Everyone always covered up for Kerry. The commanding officer covered up for him. Commanding officer called me, Ian, and said, Kerry is, he used the word indisposed, and I want you to take the men and go to the plane in England. They called the planes had numbers, and go out there and have field conditions for about a week, so to prepare the people, because we're going to have field conditions in Casablanca. So naturally I said, okay, yes sir. And he gave me, a staff sergeant, 130 men, and I forget how many trucks I requisitioned. I requisitioned all the supplies, the field kitchens, I resurrected pyramidal tents, I resurrected cots, blankets, and the whole works. I filled up a bunch of trucks with them, and I was the man. I was only a staff sergeant. I took these people out there, and they set up beds, and I had no idea how to erect a pyramidal tent. So I called everybody to attention in the front, and I said, anyone who's been in the infantry, step forward. And about 8 people stepped forward. They'd been in the infantry. And I know, and they were older people, and I know that they had equipment. And I gave each one of them a bunch of people, and they erected the pyramidal tents. And I'll tell you what, you could look down that line of pyramidal tents, and you could draw a string down the line. It was perfect what those folks could do. Anyway, we had the field rations, and they didn't give us, there was such a thing known as C rations, but we only had K rations. We got tired of K rations, and I took a Jeep, and I knew there was an English base about 4 or 5 miles away on the outskirts of this plain. So I went over there, and they stopped me at the gate, you know, and they said, who do you want to see? And I told them I wanted to see the commanding officer. So they sent me in to the base. This wasn't a big base, a small base. Went in there, And I went in, I did the proper thing, you know, and I went through the first sergeant, his first sergeant in the orderly room, went up to see him, and I said, and he was the equivalent of a major in the British Army, and I did all the proper things, salute, and you know, the proper thing you do. And I said, Major, I said, I have a problem. I've got 130 people out there, and we're on K rations, and we were just wondering if you would let us come over here to eat, because we're tired of those K rations. We only had K rations one meal. We were already tired of them. Anyway, and he yelled, he said, Sergeant! And the sergeant came in, and he said, Sergeant, he said, the sergeant here wants to know whether we can feed 130 people. You reckon you can feed them? And the sergeant kind of grinned. He said, yes, sir. He said, we shipped out 2,000 people to, this was right after the war, we shipped out 2,000 people to France the other day, and he said, sir, I'm still drawing their rations. So for the next couple of days, 3 times a day, I'd leave a detachment on guard duty. 3 times a day, we'd load the trucks down, we'd drive to the English base. I didn't have an officer. The other 3 squadrons, each one of them had an officer in charge. I didn't have an officer. I was the man. At the 3rd day, the Jeep came up, and there was this officer. He got out and he looked all around, you know, trying to see where the official headquarters were. And he asked someone, he said, who's in charge? And they pointed to me. And he came up to me and he said, Sergeant, could I speak to the officer in charge? And I said, I could be insolent and do it correctly. And he was one of these kind of supercilious, looking down on the enlisted men. He gave me that feeling. So I insolently, he said, no, sir. I'm the only one in charge, sir. Very insolent. And anyway, he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, I'm one in charge. Oh. He said, well, there's a rumor going around that the 601 is going over to that English base over there and eating over there at the English base. Can you tell me anything about that? And I said, well, yes, sir. That's what we're doing. He said, well, he didn't know what to say. Here he was, an officer, asking a poor old staff sergeant how he got that done. He said, what kind of arrangements, how he's stuttering all around the place trying to find out how I did it. And I did not tell him how to do it. I did not tell him what to do it. That same afternoon, a Jeep came roaring up, you know, and said, plans have been changed. We're not going to Casablanca. The orders are for you to put all your equipment back in their trucks and turn it back in to the supply base. So I did. And he said, the rumor has it they're going to give us 29s, B-29s, which has a longer range, and they're going to send us to the Pacific Theater of Operations. So immediately we got back on a boat and came back home. And gave me my 30-day R&R, rest and relaxation, recuperation, 30 days when you came back from overseas. During that time...
Herman, we're almost out of film time. We're almost out of screen
well,
time.
Quickly, Mr. Truman saved my life. He dropped the bombs on Hiroshima, and they decided the war with Japan was over, and they deactivated the 398th Bomb Group, and I was one of the few people who had been with the 398th Bomb Group from the very first start when it was activated in Blythe, California, till it was deactivated in Tampa, Florida.
you finished 2 seconds under the line.
Hey, good job.